All right, welcome everybody. We have a good group today, and I'm very pleased to see so many returning guests, and I'm very excited that Rob agreed to do this a couple months ago, and happy that he is here. So without further ado, Rob McDonald is the lead scientist for the Global Cities program at the Nature Conservancy. He holds a PhD in ecology from Duke University. He's published over 50 peer-reviewed publications, and he just published a book entitled Conservation for Cities. He also published a report in October 2016 that got me very excited. And this report, Planting Healthy Air, took a look from a global perspective at the issues facing cities as urbanization and population growth becomes realities for countries around the world. The issues of air pollution and excess heat are tackled in this report, and as Rob will explain, by 2050, the vast majority of all humanity will live in cities, towns, and other urban areas. This influx and densification of city dwellers will exert extra pressure on existing infrastructure and green spaces, while also making the ecological services that urban trees provide even more important. I'm going to put links to the report that he's going to talk about and his recently published book in the chat window, so you can check both of these out after his talk. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for saying yes, Rob. And I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Megan, for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. Please do let me know if y'all can't hear me. This is my first time using Zoom, and so I'm not sure how great the audio is, so please let me know if it's not great. Can everybody see my slides now, starting with my title slide?
Yep, looks good.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this particular report called Planting Healthy Air, and it focused on the role trees, particularly street trees, can play in.
Rob, let me jump in. I'm actually, I spoke too soon. I'm not. We're not seeing. We're just seeing a blank screen.
Oh, okay.
Let's have you stop sharing again. I did see PowerPoint when you first shared your screen. I saw it in edit mode. When you went into presentation mode, it seems like that's when we lost it. Let's try it again.
Yeah, how's that?
Okay, yeah, we're seeing the continent with the lights.
Yes. All right.
Yep.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
I'm glad when someone tells me there's a technical error. So why did we do this report, right? Stepping back, Megan mentioned that context, and this is what motivates me and the Nature Conservancy to work on cities, is just the urban world we live in. So this is what our continent looks like at night from space, and we are ahead of the curve. The US and Europe are probably 70–80% urban. The rest of the world just passed, I don't know, a decade ago now, 50% urban, and is going to reach similar urbanization levels to where we are in the US and Europe. So there will be another 2 billion folks in cities by 2050. So the way to get your head around that is to think about a metro area like Washington, D.C., where I live, or probably the Salt Lake City metro area. D.C. metro area is 3 million people, so picture building all of those roads and bridges and towns in about 3 weeks, and then doing that again and again and again. That is the pace of urban growth globally. And so, of course, the conservation movement has to react to that, both as a threat to biodiversity, but also to make ourselves relevant in that urban world. So one of the themes of my urban work, the book she referenced, Conservation for Cities, and indeed the Conservancy's work in cities, is to think about what role does nature play in the urban century, right? Why do people in cities need nature? And one of those obvious links is street trees and parks and the various benefits they provide. So that's the context here. And just real quick, at the Conservancy, we do a number of projects in cities. So some of them is classic conservation planning, open space planning and protection, which we sometimes call cities by design. We work a lot on water issues. The picture here is actually, I think, the High Line in New York, but we work on stormwater issues in a number of U.S. cities, stormwater green infrastructure, coastal flooding and riparian flooding issues. So there's a whole set of natural infrastructure strategies around those urban water issues that I won't talk about today, but you should know they're there. And many of you probably work on them yourselves. Certainly stormwater is a big issue in the U.S. Today we're talking about this bundle of strategies that we call healthy air. So thinking about the relationship between vegetation and air that's too hot or too dirty. So just that's where I'm going to zoom in on in a second. The picture on the right talks about nature and people, and there's a whole bundle of other activities we do to try to connect school kids in particular to nature. We have a curriculum that goes out to about 1 million kids to try to get them excited about nature. We have volunteer programs to take at-risk youth out into nature. So again, a whole body of work, and there's some interesting science about how interacting with nature affects people's cognitive development and mental health that I won't mention any further here. So without further ado, healthy air and the healthy air report. And I will start this with a story and give you some context about the goals of the report. And then I'm going to stop and pause for kind of clarifying questions before I get into the results, okay? So the story starts here in Paris, France. This is one of the more beautiful places to hang out. And I like this picture because it gives you a sense it's a really hot day. I want to take you to August 2003, when Paris and France went through one of the worst heat waves in modern history. Day after day, it was above 40 Celsius. And this is in a climate where people were not ready for that. There's not much air conditioning. People are not used to hot temperatures. And it's an interesting moment. It happened when a lot of French government was on vacation at the beach. There was sort of nobody in the central government minding the shop. I talked to the New York Times reporter who was in France that summer, and I said, "What do you remember about this big heat wave?" And he said, "Rob, I remember that there were so many deaths coming into the hospitals that they ran out of space in the morgue, and they were buying space in supermarkets. You can picture that, places to put bodies. About 70,000 people died in Europe in that week period. So that's what big heat waves can do when cities are unprepared. In the average year, about 12,000 people die in heat waves globally. But we know that with climate change, heat waves are going to get more frequent and more intense. And one study by Health Organizations that by 2050, unless cities start to adapt and get ready, there could be 250,000 people a year, mostly elderly people, mostly living by themselves, who could die in heat waves. So it's a growing threat for cities. Cities like Paris are doing heat action plans. There's lots of cities in the US doing this. And as part of that, they might be thinking about nature. I'll come back to that. So this is the other big issue that's motivating the report I'm talking about today, and it's air quality problems. The gunk you see in the slide here, which this is looking down the Champs-Élysées towards La Défense, and most of that is particulate matter. So Paris, like a lot of cities globally, has a big particulate matter problem. And in terms of air pollutants, that's the big killer. Particulate matter pollution kills around 3 million people a year in terms of outdoor air pollution. There's another burden of indoor air pollution. And it causes death sometimes in children through problems with asthma, but often actually middle-aged or older men in terms of cardiovascular health and stroke. So this is really one of the problems for especially the developing world. There really is no safe level of particulate matter. So even at the levels we have in the US, we're still trying to get reductions. And certainly Utah and Salt Lake City, because of its geography, has some unique challenges, both with particulate matter and ground level ozone. In many US cities, ground level ozone is a major challenge. We didn't focus on it too much in this report, but if folks want to talk about it more in the question and answer period, we can. So in Paris, for example, they shut down the street on weekends to encourage people to bicycle, but also to try to deal with the PM problem. So smart cities around the world are trying to figure out ways to deal with particulate matter. And we wanted to understand, does nature play a role? I put this picture in just to show that, down the road a little in Salt Lake City, this is an issue close to where y'all are as well. So lots of US cities are still struggling with this set of issues. So why were we thinking about nature? I'm going to talk about some of the basics here of how the science literature says trees can help. And then I'll stop and take some questions before I get into the bulk of the report. So trees cool by shading impervious surfaces, number one, so they're not absorbing energy from the sun. When impervious surfaces absorb energy, they then re-radiate that as thermal heat later in time. So you see this big urban heat island effect. The other ways trees cool is often overlooked, but it's actually pretty significant numerically. They cool by transpiration. So just as on a hot day when you sweat, it evaporates and you feel cooler, trees do the same thing. And so both of those effects, the transpiration effect and the shading effect, are both important. And the Paris story is important because it's one of the most well-studied heat waves in history. So that's why I put a picture. This is in Paris along the Canal de Saint-Martin. Neighborhoods like this one in Paris that were greener were 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, so 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly, cooler. And in Paris, each 1 degree Celsius reduction in air temperature reduced the death rate by 21%. That's what the epidemiologists tell us. So trees had a real effect in Paris in protecting some neighborhoods. And what we wanted to understand with this report is, well, is that true for other cities, right? How much should other cities rely on trees to protect them against heat? Trees also help reduce particulate matter by basically acting as a filter, as a surface for particulate matter to settle out on, just like dust would settle out on furniture in your house. So more leaf area is better, sticky or kind of tacky leaves are better. And then when it rains, that particulate matter is washed down the drain. So it may cause other issues as it enters the stormwater system because it's a pollutant, but we're then not breathing it in. So that's the primary mechanism by which trees work. One of the first tasks we did in the report was to review some of the literature. So when I get into the results of the report, I'll talk about what is the average effectiveness of trees on both these issues. And then the step we did apply a framework to maps of 250 cities globally. So we wanted to know, what are the benefits trees providing now in these cities based on that science evidence, based on what the average effectiveness of trees are, what's the likely effect on human well-being right now, and then how much more could trees do in the future. So that is my quick sketch of the methods, and in a second I'll jump into a lot more detail on how this mechanism works for trees cleaning and cooling the air. But I wanted to stop and open the floor for just clarifying questions. I presented you info about the problem of air quality and heat, and then a kind of a quick cartoon sketch of how trees work. Any clarifying questions up to this point?
So Rob, there are 3 questions in the Q&A, and you can use your own down at the bottom. There's a little window that pops up, and I can read them to you. So any thoughts on the vertical greening concept, like that being done in Singapore?
Yeah, that's a good question, Carl. So we didn't address it in this report because there have not been that many empirical studies of how much it helps ambient air, so air in the streetscape. And a lot of it would depend on kind of wind flow along the streetscape. There's been more studies that I know of how it's a benefit within the building in terms of heating and cooling the building. But it's a neat concept. And there's an interesting, Singapore is one of the leaders in that. France has a few of them. There's a new neighborhood in China that's going to go in where they're trying to do all buildings with green kind of vertical greening. So it'll be interesting to see what the microenvironment is there. Let's see, Carl also asked about green roofs. And you'll see me mention them in a second relative to at least cooling and air quality. So I'll come back to that one, Carl. And then Carl also asked about invasive species. We didn't focus on that in this report, and I think in general my attitude is that since cities are human created spaces, it doesn't bother me so much whether a species is non-native. I'm fine with using ginkgos in cities if they're hardy enough to deal with that harsh urban environment. But you do want to avoid invasive species. So that whole set of issues still applies. And there's some things that were classically planted, like Norway maple, that now we probably wouldn't plant. So I think I will move on here. I see Naomi added a point back on vertical greening, but I may move on to the bulk of the report, if that's okay, Megan.
Yep, that sounds, of course, go for it.
All right, so I gave you the quick sketch already of what we tried to do in this report. Came out in October, and I actually presented it at the Public Health Association, American Public Health Association conference. So for me, as an ecologist, it was a neat moment to do a report with medical public health professionals and with C40. So we did this report in partnership with the subset of cities that are really trying to use trees to cool and clean their air. So it was a neat collaboration, and at the end of the talk, I'll give you all the web link, which I understand Megan shared as well. All right, so a bit more on what we found when we reviewed the literature out there on both how trees cool the air and how they clean the air. So start in the cartoon with the left, up in the upper left. So I'll talk first about particulate matter removal. So you have dirty air flowing. Part of it is blocked by the canopy, and you can actually get locally increased concentrations of PM upstream, uphill, not uphill, upwind of a planting. And so that's an important effect to remember. We talked in the report about ways you can do your plantings to avoid that. The main places where you have to be really careful would be streets where there are sources of PM. There's a lot of traffic, for example. So then part of the PM is removed by the canopy, and that's a function of leaf area, among other things, including wind flow patterns. And then there's redilution downwind. So one of the things I guess I'll talk next about the bar charts on the right. This is showing you for a bunch of field studies the average removal, and this is often measured in the literature as deposition velocity. Here I'm showing you it for PM10, but it's similar for PM2.5 in many studies. And one thing you should notice is that these are all urban studies. Some are along roads, some are not, but the deposition velocity varies a lot. So one of the frustrations for municipal managers, that is just a fact of the scientific literature right now, is that there is some uncertainty about how effective they are on site. The dashed red line here is the average value from a particular review paper by Lovett in 1994. That is the base number that's used in iTree or U4, although it gets modified there based on other inputs the user gives. So all that's to say, it looks like urban trees may remove slightly more than the Lovett paper, which was in a rural setting, and that appears to be because there's greater mixing in an urban setting than in a closed canopy forest. Then when you get to redilution, that's the lower left kind of line chart. What this figure is showing you is the average from a bunch of papers that have measured this. Redilution happens very rapidly as you leave a planting. So by the time you are 10 meters away, 11 meters away from a planting, only about 60% of the benefit of cleaning is still there. By the time you're 30 meters away, about 40% of the benefit of cleaning is still there. And by the time you're 90 meters away, there's essentially no difference between that and the average background PM levels. So this is really important. So removal is intense locally. I'll talk about the average percentage terms in a second, but it's very local. So this is not a strategy to clean up your airshed. It doesn't help you get in compliance with the Clean Air Act. Think of this as a local secondary filter to help a streetscape get a little bit cleaner. And the same kind of picture is true for cooling when we reviewed the literature. So you have a certain area directly under the canopy that's cooler. This depends a little bit on the width of the forested patch. Bigger forested patches get cooler, actually. And then as you head away, the empirical evidence from the few papers we could find that measured this well show that it declines pretty rapidly. So again, by the time you're 90 meters away, there's essentially, in most cases in a city, street trees are having no effect when you're 90 meters away from them on the average temperature. In the right-hand side, you see the range of possible reductions in temperature. Here, the x-axis is just degrees Celsius. And so in our report, we just looked at the medium impact scenario, the mean of the empirical studies, the low impact and the high impact scenarios. So our strategy here was try to bracket at least most of the uncertainty in the literature. This is plus or minus 1 standard deviation. And then just say, if those are true, and we apply this in a GIS framework to the land forest cover maps in other cities, what are the benefits trees are probably providing? So the take-home message is that within that, we focused on a 30-meter buffer directly around the street tree plantings in cities. The range of likely PM reduction is 7 to 24%. So by no means does this solve the problems of a city like Beijing, for example, which I was talking to someone from New Delhi today, which in one period pushed 3,000 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5. And for context, the WHO suggested level is around 10 for the annual average. So trees don't solve that, but that is a meaningful reduction. And when you work through this, it looks like a significant fraction of health, a significant fraction of planting costs would be recouped in terms of reduced health expenditures. Summer temperature reduction, similar story. On average, you see a 2 to 4 degree Fahrenheit reduction, and that is in the ballpark that we talked about for the Paris heat wave event, where there are some benefits to elderly people at risk from heat waves. All right, a bit more detail on targeting. This was something we focused in on a lot in the report. Because trees do provide this locally concentrated benefit, because population density varies a lot by neighborhood, because pollution concentration varies a lot by neighborhood, and because current tree cover varies a lot, the bang for the buck that you would get on different streets varies a lot. And so I'm illustrating this here with a map for Washington, D.C., where I live. And these are the various street segments and the return on investment you would get for planting in different street segments. So we did this with U.S. Census data. So this is residential population. It isn't perfect, but it's what's freely available for U.S. cities. You can see places like the National Mall in the center, very low return on investment because nobody lives there. Although you could plant trees, I guess, to reduce air pollution for tourists or something. But then there's a center portion of the city called Columbia Heights, Mount Pleasant, where there's not much tree cover now. It tends to be more polluted and it's fairly dense. So when I've talked to DC about this, I would advise for cleaner or cooler air with trees, those might be places you target. And we talk about this in much more depth in the report. You can also think about targeting in terms of cities. So because there's so much variation between neighborhoods, almost every neighborhood has good places to plant. Almost every city has good places to plant, sorry. So even in the US and Europe, there are good places to plant. Those are the white dots here. But sorry, the legend I'm realizing is wrong here. But in terms of bang for your buck, cities in the developing world get even more bang for their buck because they're denser, pollution levels are higher, and tree planting and maintenance costs are lower. So one of the things we did for this report was look at what tree planting and maintenance costs are across countries with a bunch of different levels of economic development. And not surprisingly, countries with lower labor costs have lower tree planting and maintenance costs. So this may not be of as much interest to this audience, but certainly when I talk to the World Bank or international health organizations, this gives them a sense that this actually is a strategy that might work in much of the developing world. So all of what I just talked about was the current benefits trees are providing. We did look at future benefits. How much more could targeted planting do? And it looks like there's a lot of scope for this in cities globally. So in the US and globally, most cities appear to be losing tree cover as they densify and as we as a society are not investing very much in trees, but there's clearly space for more urban tree canopy. And if we spent the equivalent of $4 more a person a year on tree planting, you could plant enough trees to save tens of thousands of lives annually because the air is a little cleaner or a little cooler. And for every person who doesn't die, there would be lots of people who don't have their health negatively impacted. So school kids could go to school even on a bad air day. Or you have an elderly person who's avoiding a heat stroke event. So we really believe that tree planting for their benefits, as well as the whole set of other benefits that street trees and parks provide, should be part of that urban future we're heading towards. So I won't belabor this piece too much, but one of the things we did in the report was compare tree planting to other ways to clean or cool the air. And so this specific slide is about particulate matter removal, and it's just showing you the cost in dollars per ton of tree planting across the cities we studied, and then other strategies that are often done in cities around the world. So we found, I think, 50 or 60 examples of projects around the world and their average cost. So in the transport sector, you might switch to other fuels, for example. When you're doing PM control at a point source, you might put a scrubber, for example. So what you should take home is there's a huge variation in cost, first of all, between neighborhoods in terms of tree planting or between cities in terms of the cost of these projects. And the ranges overlap, so there's no simple answer. Trees are not necessarily cheaper, particularly compared to things like NOx reduction, but they're not necessarily more expensive. So in many cities, tree planting will be a slice of their PM mitigation activities, but I want to acknowledge again that it's going to be a small slice, right? We're not saying tree planting replaces doing these other strategies, but as part of our overall holistic strategy, we think it's worth thinking about. Something similar is true for cooling ambient air outside. There's a big range of costs. Again, note the x-axis here is a log axis, so there's a lot of variation. The exception here is cool roofs. So somebody mentioned that in the Q&A, but cool roofs, well, actually somebody mentioned green roofs. So cool roofs are just simply painting roofs white or using otherwise high albedo materials on roofs. That's a quite cheap technology. So if your only goal was to cool the air, you would probably try to do that on a massive scale in cities. The other technologies, cool pavements, the green roofs, obviously have these other benefits. Cool pavements tend to mitigate stormwater. Green roofs provide a set of benefits, including stormwater. But green roofs tend to be pretty expensive to put in. So on this metric, if you really want to cool a city, tree planting is quite cost effective. You would want to probably do some combination of tree planting plus painting roofs white. So we go into curves like this in the report more in depth, but I wanted to put this in just to give you a sense that part of the reason we did this was to get to what we think of in the Conservancy as the investment curve. So if the world spent an additional 500 million or billion or $2 billion a year in tree planting, how many more trees could you plant, and how many people would get a certain level of reduction in particulate matter? So you see all these curves flatten out, which you would generally expect for an analysis of return on investment. So you reach saturation and you're planting at sites where you don't have a lot of benefits. But you should notice all the curves start very steeply on the left. So if you prioritize tree planting in, say, the top 10% best sites in a city, you can get a lot of bang for your buck in a pretty small area. So I'm concluding here, but Megan mentioned a little bit the future, and I mentioned it in my earlier remarks. All of this matters more in the future. We're going to be a hotter world and a more crowded world. The more crowded piece means there's likely to be more particulate matter pollution, just because there'll be many more of us in cities and we're burning more energy, especially in the developing world. But it doesn't have to be a horrible future, right? You can imagine that cities in Southeast Asia try to get up to US and European levels in particulate matter control, so they really clean up the air. You can imagine that cities around the world set up heat action plans so they don't have the massive potential mortality risk that the the WHO is worried about. We think trees are part of that, and so trees, if they're important now, they'll get more important in the future. But right now, the trend line is going the other direction. There's actually less trees. So I wrote the report trying to inspire action and more conversation between the urban forestry community and the public health community, both as a way to raise awareness, but also as a way to maybe increase some financing and funding for urban trees. So that was my quick tour of the report. All the results are online, the PDF report, but as well as zoomable maps of different cities. So you can zoom in neighborhood by neighborhood and see the potential for trees to help. And I think I'll just end by going back to the multifaceted way nature helps in cities. I really focused in this talk on the Planting Healthy Air report, trees as a way to cool or clean the air, but they do lots of other benefits. And to me, this picture from Seoul is a great example of it. This is a river through the heart of downtown Seoul. It used to look a lot like what our Los Angeles River looks like, a channelized canal for stormwater, basically. And there were no fish in it. It was basically a dead space. And in fact, it was even worse than the LA River because they put a highway on top of it. So the city, at pretty great expense, has renovated and restored this space to what you see here. This isn't nature in the way a lot of my Nature Conservancy colleagues would talk about it, right? This landscape architects decided what to put here, but it's still providing important benefits to folks in cities. And it's this kind of inspirational project that provides multiple benefits that I hope we can think of and seize the opportunity of as we move into the urban century. So I will stop there and I will open up the Q&A again.
Great. Thank you, Rob.
So should I read a few of these off, Megan?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if you also open the phone lines or if you usually do it through the chat box.
They're usually through the Q&A where we have folks ask questions, but that's a good question. I don't know if people calling in would be able to ask questions, so go for it.
Well, I'll read a few off the box, that's fine. So Naomi made a good point that, going back to vertical greening, that the wooden material may not last. So yes, certainly in terms of carbon sequestration, for example, that's not a good strategy. It's also not clear if it cools or cleans the ambient air away from the building. So the honest answer, Naomi, is I don't know yet if vertical greening provides the kind of benefits I'm talking about here. Let's see, Zach asked a really good question about deciduous trees. And it's absolutely true that deciduous trees in the winter, when they use their leaves, are not providing either of these benefits. And so in places where there's a winter pollution profile, that's a problem. You can use evergreen trees in certain places as screens then, but that does limit the effectiveness. And for instance, we have an office in Beijing, and that's something I've talked about with them, that it's naturally deciduous climate, and for the most part, their problems are in the winter, and the trees are not going to help them then. Beijing is also another interesting example of proximity being necessary. So if you look, both the Beijing government and actually the Mexico City government have announced big plans to do green belts pretty far from the city center, somewhat premised on air quality benefits. And I would say that our results suggest that those cities should be a little hesitant about assuming that that's going to work, because most of the benefits, again, are within 30 meters or so of a planting. All right, I'll do a couple more questions here, and Megan, feel free to ask questions too.
No problem.
Carl asked a little bit about the other benefits, right? And certainly nature has an important role to play for both physical and mental health. The physical health piece is often mediated by recreation. So just having a space for people to get out into. So I would, street trees are important for that, but arguably urban parks are probably more important. So a little bit different feature there, but connected, right? You want to have natural features so that we're combating the obesity crisis that the U.S. faces. Mental health is a really exciting benefit, and it's still a bit mystifying in the literature, the extent to which it's happening and how much we should invest in it. So there are some clear examples that it happens, right? You take school kids or college kids out to a forest and their stress levels are less, they do better on tests. It's been shown that kids with symptoms of attention deficit disorder, if they have some time in nature and to get some of that stress out, focus better later. There's some really compelling examples from hospitals, for example, that patients in rooms with a view of nature heal faster, heal a day faster on average, gallbladder patients do, than patients who don't have that nature view. And so there are hospitals in the Netherlands, I think, that have been designed so most of their patients have nature views. So I would love to see more work on this link between nature and mental and physical health. So to us at the Conservancy, we think of it all as a complete package. So we try to talk to cities about nature and trees for health. But today, for purposes of this report, I did focus in on the air quality.
So there's a couple comments. I'm going to let you read through them, and you can address them in whatever order you think makes sense. But what I really appreciated is that you didn't sell this report as being a huge answer to big air pollution problems. Like, I really like how you intertwine throughout your report that this is just one strategy to help deal with the localized air pollution and the localized heat island effects. So the sort of big picture view is what I've appreciated throughout this whole talk. Yeah,
and maybe I'll emphasize that again. I mean, by giving an example, so in Louisville, we have an urban program there. We've been collaborating with the University of Louisville Medical School, actually, their cardiovascular lab. And there's been some interesting studies, for example, where they've put in green buffers separating a school from a highway. And so it's worked in a sense, like particulate matter levels and air pollutant levels are less. You can see that in the air. You actually can see that in the student's blood as well. And so there are some health benefits. But do the trees solve the overall problem, which is, you have a school, the playground is next to a highway, basically. No, the trees don't solve that overall problem. Given where the school is, it's a good strategy, and we're encouraging the city to do more of kind of vegetative buffers like that. And you can even do it in combination with a wall, right? So there's been some good studies the EPA has done that the most effective highway barrier is actually kind of a sound barrier and then a vegetative buffer on next to it. And then you're stopping the sound, you're stopping the air pollutants that way, and then any air pollutants that sort of slip over the wall, you can catch them in a vegetative buffer.
Interesting. I'm going to ask Mark to launch the poll. So before folks leave, I'd ask you to just take a couple minutes to answer a couple questions and help us evaluate how we're doing as hosting this webinar series. And we have a bunch of questions waiting, so I'm going to let...
I can answer a few more if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So maybe I'll go to a technical question. Jeffrey asked about, is there a difference between ring porous and diffuse porous on VOC absorption? I will answer that specifically by saying I don't know. The general question about VOC is a good one, though. So I didn't focus in on this talk much on ground level ozone. And so it's worth saying a few words about that link between trees and ground level ozone. So for PM, the situation is simpler. Trees are almost always a filter of PM, except for that issue of blocking. With some exceptions, there can be some secondary PM formation because of things like VOC. But for ozone, it's a much more complicated picture. So for ground level ozone formation, trees decrease the temperature, which can reduce ozone formation. They can also directly absorb ozone, which helps solve some of that problem. But they do emit VOCs, and so in parts of the U.S. that are sort of VOC limited, the net effect of vegetation for ground level ozone can be negative. More vegetation can cause more of a problem. There is a big variation in VOC emissions by plant species. So to some extent, urban planners can get around that by picking the right species. But acknowledging that already urban foresters have a really hard job, right? They have to think about what's going to be viable at a site, what's aesthetically beautiful, what's going to be robust to climate change. So to also ask urban foresters to think about the level of VOC emissions or the level of PM reduction, maybe they should be thinking about those things too. I would say they should be, but it's adding another thing to an already long list.
And that sort of piggybacks on what Core asked. Some cities grow very fast. How would you advise urban planners to insert your findings there? And that was something that I was gonna, if we have a lot of urban folks tuning in today, so they want to take your report, but they might not want to read 160 pages of it. Is this report going to help them figure out where to plant the trees, or is your report making the case the trees are important and they should go elsewhere to find out, hey, the trees, retaining trees in this location might be the best, get the best bang for your buck?
So we tried to do a little bit of both in the report. So we talk about, we have these maps for all the cities of where would the biggest bang for your buck be in terms of return on investment from planting, if you could put it in more trees. And then we have in generic terms, guidance on how you would space trees, which species you might want to use. So I'd encourage folks to check that out. I took Core's question a little different because a lot of the science in the Planning Healthy Report was about the current urban fabric, right? What streets that are already there should you go on? When you're talking about greenfield development, the picture is a little different. Generally, I feel like the best practice there is as those developments happen, you have municipal regulations that maintain some tree canopy cover if you can, and or require the developer to do some planting as part of their development activity. And the interesting trade-off there, this is where the environmental community needs to have a discussion. Part of the environmental community would advocate for very dense cities, right? Dense, walkable cities. They're better for us because we're getting recreation. They're better for the planet because we're not emitting greenhouse gases because we're not driving everywhere. On the other hand, from this perspective of providing ecosystem services, it's good to have some trees. And so if you have a very high density, it can be hard to fit in trees into something the density of Manhattan or something. So probably there's some happy medium there that can be quite dense. I live in a neighborhood in DC that's 6-story buildings, and so compared to most U.S. cities, quite high population density, but we're up at 40% canopy. So it is possible to have a pretty high canopy and still have pretty high population density. But I get asked that a lot. To some extent, there is an interesting trade-off there.
Is that because you live in that neighborhood that you have such a high canopy cover, or?
No, well, I think it's also from the history of that neighborhood, which is kind of right around World War II. The interesting thing in the U.S. is we actually used to spend a lot more on tree planting in new neighborhoods than we do now. Municipal planning budgets on average in the U.S. are down about 40% since the 1970s on a per capita basis. So even though the science is telling us trees are more important, we're spending a little less. Hey, maybe I'll answer the question Deb Powers asked about what happens to the particulate matter after it's collected on leaves. Yeah, it just washes off. And in fact, from an air quality perspective, you hope you occasionally get rain to wash it off. Otherwise, in truly arid systems, you can start to plateau, like there's no more space for PM to settle on leaf. And yes, it becomes then a stormwater pollution problem. Out of all the things cities worry about in terms of their stormwater pollutants, this is a pretty small fraction of it in most cities. They're much more worried usually about the fraction of pollutants that are on road surfaces that get washed away by stormwater. But yeah, to some extent, like the trees in Paris, when they grab that particulate matter and it goes down the gutter, then that pollution is going down into the Seine or wherever the stormwater system drains through in Paris.
Kimberly asked an interesting question. Can you share some non-traditional partnerships in which you have engaged to improve reach into and engage diverse communities in tree planting efforts here in the U.S.? That might not be your expertise, or.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. And I think non-traditional partnerships are really important. And it's a space that's maybe newer for the Nature Conservancy, honestly. Like, people think of us as mostly biodiversity focused. We did start off as a land trust. And so we have been used to, for decades, working with non-traditional communities in, I guess, rural landscapes, right? Ranchers, farmers, indigenous groups in Brazil. But when you get in the urban space, I think it's been newer for us to have to go to local community groups. So, for example, in our work in Washington, D.C., we have a focus on stormwater there and stormwater green infrastructure, helping them meet their obligations to EPA, helping clean up the Chesapeake Bay, which all of our stormwater and sewage runs into from DC. We've tried to do that work really intentionally in partnership with groups like the Anacostia Watershed Society that have links to the local community. So I think that's one way we've tried to approach it, knowing that we're more sometimes the technocrats or the ecologists or something. We're trying to build partnerships that speak to what communities want. Because my take on the empirical evidence, and there's been some great papers on this by Morgan Grove from the Baltimore LPR, when you don't have local community buy-in, most green infrastructure projects fail. The sites will tend to be polluted, or they tend to be controversial, and you get pushback in City Hall. So having some public buy-in and support for any tree planting plan is really quite essential. The other non-traditional partnership I would highlight is the one I feel like that's developing between urban foresters and health departments or the health sector. The last couple of weeks, there's been some interesting news about a project that some researchers at the University of Illinois are doing with Kaiser Permanente, right? So they're trying to understand how urban forestry helps meet health objectives in communities where Kaiser has a lot of insurees. So that, when I was in grad school getting my PhD, we didn't even think about that kind of linkage. So the fact that it's happening and there are ecologists and medical doctors working together on a project like that, to me, that's another kind of non-traditional partnership that's really exciting.
I believe in Utah, I think it's Physicians for Clean Air, or but yeah, we have a similar partnership or a similar organization like that happening in Utah, and they're big advocates for reductions of PM 2.5. Hillary had a quick question about a guideline for wind direction.
Yeah, that's a good question. And Hillary, you highlight another important issue there, which is the way the cooling effect of trees, it cools the air outside, but it also, if it shades the house, it can reduce electricity use in the summer particularly substantially. And so that's why for reducing electricity use, the Southwest is the best place to put those trees, so that you're catching that hot heat and light in the afternoon. You're right. You would think about predominant wind direction, and you would want, if you wanted to plant a tree to help with air quality, you'd think about predominant wind direction. You'd also think about what space are you outside in, if that makes sense. Like, and to some extent, actually to a fairly large extent, particulate matter outside infiltrates your house. So if you're going in and out your front door, for example, a lot, then having trees near the street or kind of shading that front door will help with the PM in that small little microclimate, and that will help prevent the PM from getting into your house. Whereas if you had the tree on your backyard, fairly far from your house in a place you don't go much, maybe it's going to supply less benefit.
Great. And Cor just had another question. I might ask Mark to relaunch the poll and so folks can review, but Cor had a question. What possibilities do you see for urban trees other than park-like street tree linings? I mean, really ecologically important green zones, so.
Yeah, the reason we focused on street trees for this report was because the proximity looks to be so important for air quality and heat. In most urban contexts, that is going to be the place where you're going to provide it. So even though a lot of cities have goals of having a park within a kilometer, right, or a mile or something, half a mile of homes, that looks like it's far enough away that in most contexts it's not going to clean or cool the air right next to where people live. But for these other benefits that some of the other commenters asked about, like recreation, the park space is going to be really important. And there's interesting ways that these things can fit together. So some of the cities that we've interacted with, like Toronto, for example, Toronto's this interesting case study where the health department has talked directly with the urban forestry department about the urban planning priorities. And there are some specific buildings they're very worried about with heat waves. You don't think of Toronto as hot, but every now and then they get a big heat wave and they know with climate change it's going to happen. And there are large public housing projects that don't have any air conditioning right now. So they're trying to cool those spaces and then create sort of cool corridors to cooling centers. So that's a term that I'm hearing more and more, is this idea that maybe you don't have the money to plant trees everywhere to cool down the streets, but you have these linear cooler streets that are either major pedestrian right-of-ways, like a business district, a shopping district, or they're connecting people to a cooling center during that big heat wave. So, Cora, I hope that's helpful. I'm riffing a little bit off your idea.
Great, Rob. Well, I just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time to present today, and our webinar next month is timely for what you've talked about. May 9th, we're going to have Heidi Kratch from the University of Nevada, and she's going to discuss managing trees during drought conditions. So this is something that's relevant to all of us who deal with trees, and as climate change becomes a big reality for us, managing trees during drought conditions is even more important. So thanks again, Rob, for taking the time to present today. Thanks for all the great questions. If you would like CEUs for attending, what we ask is that you enter your ISA and SAF information in your registration page. If you forgot to do that, send me an email and I'll make sure that you get credits. Thanks for the technical support, Mark, and everybody have a great day.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, guys.
For the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Bye.